Welcome to Diagnosing DX, the podcast giving diagnostics the platform it deserves. While therapeutics and devices often take centre stage, diagnostics is the engine driving precision medicine. I'm your host, David Philby, and each week we spotlight the innovators, breakthroughs, and real-world challenges shaping the future of DX. In today's episode, I'm joined by Dr. Russ Lebovitz, CEO of Amprion, the company making neurodegenerative diseases visible up to 20 years before symptoms. We talk about how misfolded proteins drive Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and related disorders, and how Amprion's test is changing clinical trials and early intervention, and what it takes to build a diagnostics company in one of the toughest environments in biotech. Welcome, Russ, to the show this week. How are you?
I'm doing great, David. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I'm really looking forward to this. Well, when I was prepping and doing some sort of research and stuff, I was coming into this episode thinking this will be an episode where I probably have to ask the most stupid questions because I'm absolutely excited to learn from your perspective about everything Amprion are doing, but also the science and why it's important. There's such an interesting topic that I feel like I'm going to learn a lot on this one. So I'm really excited to get to talk to you today. Before we do that, I think it's probably best for you to introduce yourself, everything you've been doing, Russ, and sort of give this the insight into who you are, what you've been doing in your career, and what you're doing now.
Great. So before I get to that, David, I want to say there are no stupid questions. Anytime, questions are what make us think more about what we're doing, and there are never enough questions, just to be clear. So I'm Russ Lebovitz. I'm the CEO of Amprion. Amprion's a diagnostic company focused on neurodegenerative diseases, and that includes the most prevalent Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, frontotemporal dementia, ALS, and others. They all seem to share a mechanism by which the diseases spread throughout the brain because of normal proteins misfolding into different shapes, and that both removes those proteins from their active role, and it may mean that the misfolded proteins seem to be able to transmit the disease between cells. So it could start in a small number of cells and spread throughout the brain. And so Amprion has developed tools to detect these fairly rare misfolded proteins. They're rare outside of cells in the brain, and it's turned out to be very useful, and it predicts pathology very early in disease, sometimes 20 years or more, and very accurately.
Wow. Okay, we're going to get into this. So this is super exciting. Before we do that, Russ, what's your background and how did you get into and originally found Amprion?
Sure. So, I originally trained as a physician, and my specialized training was in pathology. So that's all about diagnosis. I've always been interested in diagnosis, whether that's looking at tissue itself or looking at fluid biomarkers or other types of biomarkers. So that was my background. I also have training. I received a PhD in molecular biology. So really, that sums up who I've always been. I'm interested in learning about diseases, in diagnosing diseases based on their molecular footprints rather than the way it looks under a microscope or something that's based on symptoms. All of these are critically important in healthcare, but my focus is on diagnosis using tools to understand the molecules that cause and spread diseases.
And has that predominantly been around the neuro space or oncology
No.
and other
Yeah,
areas?
for me, it was originally oncology because the breakthroughs here came, I'd say there are three major phases. First, antibodies. Antibodies allowed us to detect certain types of proteins that are relatively abundant. Then came DNA and RNA, and it turns out that those are the major drivers in oncology that we can detect. And then this whole thing with misfolded proteins came because I was very much aware of specific molecular causes of disease. And one that's always interested me were the idea of what's called a prion or a prion, which is a disease caused by normal proteins, no DNA or RNA, and yet which spread throughout mainly the brain, but there are misfolded protein diseases that are systemic as well. It's always fascinated me. And almost 20 years ago, maybe 15, I met a scientist, a young scientist at the time. We were all much younger 15 years ago, who was really focused on understanding how misfolded proteins work and how they spread disease throughout the brain. And he was able to mimic this in a test tube. And we came up with the idea together, along with some other scientists around the world, that this could ultimately be used to diagnose these diseases. And Amprion was about the journey of translation, taking these very basic research findings, turning it into something that was reliable, validatable, and commercial.
Mm. With the misfolded proteins, the prions, is there a cause for that, or is that something that can just happen naturally in the body over time? What's the initial cause for that?
Well, great question. So here's what we know. It can be caused. There are certain mutations that tend to cause these proteins to misfold. That represents a minority of people with the diseases, but it teaches us something, that the proteins have the potential. With certain genetic mutations, you may increase that. We also find that if someone has an extra copy of one of these genes, so in principle, 3 copies instead of 2, you're increasing the concentration in principle by 50%, and that is enough. So these proteins that misfold in disease all have the potential, but generally you either have to have an altered form, you may have a higher concentration, and then we've learned through genetics of people who get these diseases that the frequency of disease is increased in people who, for whatever reason, carry very subtle mutations that make it harder to degrade proteins in a cell. So if you increase the concentration by making too much, degrading it too slowly, or if you have a form of the protein that just naturally tends to misfold more easily, all of those can happen. But most of the diseases are sporadic, meaning they're not known genetic traits that you can predict, but we always learn quite a bit from the genetic forms.
And so this is the same. It's in terms of these prions, it's the same that we see in mad cow disease. Is that I think that came across that in my research. What's the correlation there?
Well, yeah. So mad cow disease, which is a variant of a disease called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, was the index disease for which the whole concept of a prion was discovered and worked through. So, it's a relatively rare disease that was caused by a misfolded protein, and only a misfolded protein. So there was a lot of great work on this class of diseases. At least 1 and probably 2 Nobel Prizes were given in the 60s and 80s for the work done on this. And really, at Amprion, we recognize this, but Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease is not a disease that is prevalent enough to build a company. So one
Mm.
of the things that we did translationally was to believe and understand and pursue this concept that much more prevalent diseases, again, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, FTD, ALS, and others, would be caused by something similar. In the brain, there were hints that might be true, so we had to work on dissecting it. And really what Amprion has done that's had the greatest impact was to pick one of these proteins called alpha-synuclein, which is a very abundant protein in the brain, and has been known that Parkinson's disease, Lewy body dementia, and a number of other diseases are caused by misfolding of alpha-synuclein. So really, that's what we targeted and developed tools to detect very sensitively misfolded alpha-synuclein. And then, when we look in people and follow them for a while with the help of physicians around the world, we've learned that these misfolded proteins, once detected in the spinal fluid, really indicate that the disease is active and spreading. And again, it correlates with pathology. Once they've run the full course, and passed away, if they were positive for our test, almost always you will see signs in the brain of misfolded synuclein. If our test is negative, when they run the course of their disease, there is none, meaning it was something else. And yet we can do this 20 years earlier. In some cases, when there are extraordinarily subtle signs.
So, Russ, what the goal of the test then, and this is assumption on my part, but does that mean you want to be able to test as early as possible? And if so, or I guess a better question would be, when do you want to be able to test or run your diagnosis, and what does that then mean as a follow-up? Does that then improve the standard of care these people are receiving? Does it extend life, or what's the sort of significance of when
Sure.
the test is made?
Well, I'd like to say all of the above. So, early diagnosis for a disease that progresses slowly and incapacitates people, beginning in their 60s and often shortens their life. Early diagnosis, we initially are targeting people at an early stage of disease where an intervention could make a substantial difference. And so this could be people who have a family history, um,
Right.
people who have genetic predisposition, um, or people who show very subtle symptoms that seem to be related to the disease early. So there are certain sleep disorders and there are certain changes that may happen 10 years before disease.
So does that mean if you're able to test for it with people that have it, have a family history of this disease, right? And you test for something, and they come back positive at that point, but they're showing no symptoms. Is that an indication that they are 100% going to get one of these diseases, or is there a chance that these people would never get it, but they carry or they have a challenge?
Well, I mean, that's the question we still have yet to answer. What we know is once there is any sign at all or reason to suspect disease, that almost everyone who is positive for our test goes on to have disease. Now,
Right.
if it starts in someone who is 80, they may not. These things take 20 years or more to manifest and to spread enough where you have symptoms. But clearly, if there is any reason to believe that there might be disease and they are positive, we believe that when they are positive with our test, the disease is actively spreading. And they,
Mm.
are somewhere, um, you know, 5 to 20 years away from having active symptoms and progressive disease. So, we really want to target people who have a reason to suspect that there may be something going on. Later, if we find that everyone, that this could have a benefit, for example, when there are really active drugs, you may want to know when there are no symptoms whatsoever. But right now, we're targeting people who have what we call either prodromal symptoms, which I said could be a sleep disorder, loss of sense of smell that you can't explain any other way. So, or people who have family history or a genetic predisposition. And we now know that there are a number of drugs being developed. So,
Mm,
these drugs will work best. It is early because it's very difficult to reverse damage to neurons in the brain since they don't regenerate. And so the earlier you can find something and the earlier you can slow it down, the greater the benefit. We
mm,
also know from recent work that, at least with respect to Parkinson's and Lewy body dementia, that exercise and diet, when aggressively applied, can slow down the disease. So it is
yeah.
important there to be able to know early, because if you know you have the disease, you then undertake a very aggressive lifestyle change, and you get the disease at 110 instead of at 80, that has a very significant impact on life. So we believe that opportunity is present right now.
Mm. Diagnostic testing in the neuro field is a really hot topic at the moment. You mentioned that your test is 20 years ahead of what the current standard workflow is. Explain that to me. Are we?
Sure. So
How bad is the access to great diagnosis, or how
yeah,
bad has it been?
this isn't about anything being bad. Generally, people will go to see a doctor when there are symptoms that interfere with their lives.
Right.
So let's assume from the time the disease starts in the brain molecularly, it can take 15 to 20 years to get to the point where you have symptoms. So that's really all this is about, is if one shows up when there are active symptoms of cognitive disorders or movement disorders, then it's spread. It's believed that for Parkinson's, for example, 80% of the cells in the critical regions that lead to the disease have already been destroyed by the time you have symptoms. Now imagine you have a window of 10 to 20 years before that when you know you have the disease, and if you could stop it dead in its tracks, you never get symptoms. So none of this is meant to condemn what we do. Our motto is we treat diseases when there are symptoms. The molecular changes precede the symptoms by a fairly long period of time. So that's just an advantage. There is absolutely nothing wrong with the system the way it works. If something is invisible, there's no reason to try to treat it. What we've done, and others, is to be able to make these diseases non-invisible during this latent period.
I understand. And you mentioned then about the advancements we're seeing in the therapeutic side, um, with the ability to diagnose so early with your test. How is the standard of therapeutics out there commercialized, available on the market as we speak? And are there things that Amprion are able to do to have an impact on the standard of therapeutics available?
Absolutely. So there are two aspects to all of this. One is, as we've discussed over the last few minutes, early diagnosis leads to early intervention and substantially improved outcomes if you stop something before there's a lot of damage. So there's one. The second is that for the neurodegenerative diseases, symptoms tend to reflect the part of the brain that's damaged, but different molecules can do this. And we have learned that there are different misfolded proteins that can affect the same region. So drugs tend to target a specific molecule. So you would like to know patients in a clinical trial actually have the molecular defect that you are targeting. Otherwise, that drug will not work in those that have a different molecule. So Amprion can help in several ways. One, by early recognition of disease. Two, by getting the molecular diagnosis correct. and three, by helping drug developers understand how, for example, a number of drugs might be targeted against misfolding of the protein, and Amprion can help with that directly.
Yeah, so the actual design of clinical trials and the advancements of therapeutics that are being trialed and tested on populations of patients to bring earlier therapeutics to market that people can actually manage the conditions before they start to show up as symptoms.
Yeah, it can be life changing to be early, and it's essential if you're building a drug to know that you are treating patients who that drug actually targets molecularly. So, it's complex, but, what we do and others who do complex diagnostics that's really the goal, is to improve overall outcomes substantially.
Yeah, makes sense. So let's talk about the business side of Amprion. Um, Give me an insight in sort of the journey that you've been on with Amprion up until this point, when it started and how you guys have developed, and where are you guys now?
Sure. So, we start with the science. And very early, the first thing we did, knowing that we had some tools that could be used for looking at protein misfolding, was to build an R&D team to flesh this out, to make it as efficient as possible, as scalable as possible. Once we had that, we then built a clinical operations team to operationalize it for validation, to prove that it works and it works all of the time and that it correlates. Particularly, we have focused on pathology, so we needed to, in our clinical and research operations, to partner with doctors who are very dedicated to the patients, to where they follow them throughout their lives and actually collect their brains after they pass away from these diseases, so that our tests can correlate with the pathology, which is the ultimate gold standard, or maybe even the platinum standard. And we have done that. So then we had to build a clinical lab, and we had to get everything validated and to be legal, to be able to sell and give results. And at the same time, we had to build, as part of that, a regulatory team who knows all the rules. And in conjunction with that, we had to build a quality team. So, clinical diagnostics is very complex. There are many pieces. You have to operate every day with very high quality standards. So it's a very intensive and expensive proposition before you launch your first test, and then you have to do that every single day. So, it's been a business challenge. And while I may have started off on the science side, we were able to recruit people who can focus on that, so that I could build a team on the financial side and the operations side, and to keep all of this machine running.
Mm. Did you ever see yourself being the CEO of a company, or is that something that's just naturally happened and now
Eh,
you're
It
you're
it
you're in
it
it?
evolved. I've done this isn't the first early stage company that I've worked with. Most of them were in some sort of diagnostics, but you learn. I've served as the chief medical officer. I started off working in companies in R&D. Then it was necessary to do operations. So at Amprion, I had done a lot of these roles. So it, it was logical, since I understood from a medical point of view and a scientific point of view and an operations point of view, that it would work best, since I could do all of those things. And then what I've been able to do is to find people who are better at each one of those roles than I might have been. And my job is to build a team, support that team, and to a certain extent lead that team, although they are great and it's a two-way uh, communication all of the time.
I think you say it really well, Russ, because we hear about you know rich experience, scientific backgrounds, suddenly thrust into leading companies, and it typically comes down to the personality at that point, and can that scientist have humility to say, I need to build the team and I'm not supposed to own everything and be in the middle of everything. I need to build that team around me that I can sort of delegate and let own, and let them spread their wings to ensure that we have a successful company. How long has the test been commercialized now? When did you set up your Clear lab in Cap Lab? How long has it been on the market?
Yeah, I mean, I think we got our first approval late in 2021 or early 2022. And then here's another part that we haven't talked about yet. So, now you're dressed up and know where to go because commercial is completely separate. So we have a test. No one knows about it. No one's used it clinically. So we have to get it out there and sell it. So we've also brought on a very senior and knowledgeable commercial team, business development, clinical sales. Amprion's revenue comes predominantly from three sources. One is from what we'll call pharma, and that could be pre-clinical trial or clinical trial work.
Yeah.
It comes from academic research. So many scientists need this answer in order to pursue their grants. And then the third piece, and the one that can grow the most, is the clinical testing. And
Mm.
so, as a small company with limited resources, so for the commercial, Amprion has been fortunate to partner with one of the preeminent specialty laboratories certainly in the US, which is Mayo Clinic laboratories.
Mm.
And so, they have a sales team that already knows these doctors and talks to them about these diseases, the neurodegenerative and other neurologic diseases. And so this partnership gives them a very important and proprietary test that they can sell, and it gives Amprion an experienced commercial team who already has the relationships with doctors, trusted relationships, and with hospitals and healthcare systems. And so this is a great match. For Amprion, it would have taken us several more years to build a team like this, and significant amounts of capital that would just go to build a commercial team. So, these are all the things when you ask me my journey. Well, this isn't mostly about me. It's every step you understand that commercialization of science is thoroughly different than working as a research scientist. It's just you don't have to think about sales. You don't have to think about regulatory as a pure scientist or as a clinical scientist, but as a CEO of a diagnostics company. There are many pieces. Every single one of them have to work, and they have to work together.
Russ, do you think it's I mean, the partnership with Mayo Clinic is obviously super exciting. Do you think it's being the CEO of a diagnostics company is particularly challenging against sort of the other sides of, whether it's the therapeutic biotech side or even like med device side, which we sort of tend to get, live in the shadows in between both. But, do you think diagnostics is particularly challenging?
I do, and let's talk about why. So one is, as I've said, you have to operate every day under very rigid rules. So there's an expense every single day. And historically, I would say the reimbursement for diagnostics significantly trails therapeutics, including drugs and devices and biologics, compared to the amount of work that have to go. They all require a lot of work. But in the end, the reimbursement for diagnostics, it has been significantly less. So we always have to be concerned with cost. There are, our opportunities to be able to be reimbursed are a fraction of what we could charge, regardless of what the costs are, compared to a drug, a biologic, or a device. That's just the reality of the situation. And what it means is we can't go to market with something until it is sufficiently scalable and that we can be profitable at the reimbursement that is there.
Mm. It all sounds backwards, doesn't it? I mean, the logic behind reimbursing a a drug for somebody who's who's been diagnosed with something and has symptoms and is struggling every day, compared to a smaller amount of reimbursement for something that could detect something early and take the pressure off healthcare systems, off that patient's life, and extend it and give them much more joy in life. It's almost completely backward, isn't it? It doesn't make sense to me.
It's certainly partially upside down, but everything operates by precedent and history. So, diagnostics early on measured things that were somewhat of a commodity, not so much specialized or proprietary. So, the rules were put in place for tests for things like ions or um, hemoglobin, things that could be done in a non-proprietary manner using, off-the-shelf equipment. As we get to more complicated tests, it it costs much more. The costs of development may not be quite that of drugs, but you need some sort of a clinical trial.
Yeah.
You need high regulation at all times, and um, that's just the way it is. That is the world we operate in. I don't think that it is Amprion's job to change the policy, even if we might like to and patients might benefit. I think it's Amprion's job to be as effective as possible within the rules and obviously to push for the highest reimbursement that we can fairly receive. But we have to operate within the rules, and that's part of my job. Is we don't go to market until it's something that we can do for we can receive more than it costs us, because the old rule is, so you lose money, you make it up on volume. That's the ultimate joke on these things. So no, you don't make it up on volume unless you are profitable with every single test. So that is our obligation, to stay in business. And it's a challenge, and that's why we have these very talented teams who look at everything that we have to do.
Yeah, makes sense. Russ, you guys have had some really significant good news. You mentioned the Mayo Clinic partnership, but you also raised a Series B and had an FDA approval recently, or
Yeah,
last year maybe. Talk us through
yeah. So
that.
just to be clear, the for a variety of reasons in the U.S., the FDA doesn't regulate laboratories that run a test and provide a service. Now, Amprion's goal is to offer a test as a kit that we can then sell to laboratories, and that we are working on with FDA. What we did receive from FDA are two things. One was very early, we had a breakthrough status, and that really just means that the FDA looks at an unmet need and a technology that might fulfill that unmet need and says, we want to help, so we'll make it easier for you to work with us. And that's great. But the more important thing that we received was an explicit letter of support from FDA saying, we've now looked at clinical data from this test, as patients have been analyzed, and we believe that this is really important, and we encourage any drug companies operating and producing devices or drugs or biologics in this space to seriously consider using Amprion's test to at least stratify or for inclusion, exclusion in those trials. That's a much more that requires more scrutiny and a lot more data. We couldn't have
Mm.
received that until we had collected a lot of data and published it. And to be clear and fair, we didn't solicit that. This was solicited by advocacy organizations for Parkinson's and Lewy body dementia. They
Wow,
went to the FDA, so that's great for us.
fantastic. Um, Russ, there's a lot of people listening to this show, whether it's people early in their career who are sort of in research, in clinical trials and in development, or whether it's early stage founders and C-suite who are seed Series A stage. um, they'd be looking at Amprion going, you guys have done incredibly well, and actually it's not, it's the minority of diagnostics companies that get to the stage that you're at. What do you think it is about Amprion that has made you make it? Why have you guys been able to get to where you've got to?
Sure. So let me answer that in with a few parts. First, as a diagnostics company, it is always uphill. It is never downhill. And so we are persistent. We continually improve what we do. We try to manage our costs as efficiently as possible. And so that's necessary. You have to survive long enough to have a success. But second, is science is great, but practical translational science is a lot of luck. So when we hear about drugs succeeding or not succeeding, the same amount of work and the same clever ideas go into the ones that succeed and don't succeed, and the difference there is partially luck. And so we Amprion has been very fortunate that what we do turns out to match what's in the brain. If it didn't, we would have less value and we would have worked just as hard and raised just as much money. So I always want to be clear on this, that we work hard, we do the right things, we follow the rules, but there's a significant amount of luck. And when you have it, you're obliged then to pursue it and get it into the hands of as many patients as possible.
I love the way you've said it, Russ. I also think that, um, outside of the luck of the science working in terms of the effect it has and the the accuracy and everything else it produces, there's so many there's so much good science in the diagnostics world that where these companies are set up to not succeed because you've mentioned earlier they don't understand their reimbursement pathway, they don't understand their regulatory pathway, they don't understand how they're going to commercialize once they get to that and what the options are. And so I think on a business sense, that Amprion should also be really proud, and I know you are, but I mean I think you're being you're being humble. I think you've done incredibly well. There's so many diagnostics companies that would look at you and go, it's not just their science. They've done incredibly well to get to where they've been and to now have established partnerships with Mayo and so forth. So it's fantastic to see.
Well,
Um, Go on, Russ.
yeah. So, what I'd say if I've done anything well, it's
Here we go.
really um, being able to understand what we need, understand my limitations, and to recruit and keep a very talented team and to let
Mm,
them get credit for what they do, certainly internally and when appropriate externally. That's, my job is to find people who have a desire to do something important, give them something important to do, and then make sure they have the tools to succeed and the recognition that they deserve and the
yeah,
mentoring that they need.
that's awesome. Russ, what does the future look like from here? What are the milestones that you guys have over the sort of next 6 to 12 months? You mentioned potentially um, getting a test kit into the hands of patients, but what do them future milestones look like?
Yeah. So milestones for us are right now we have a test for alpha-synuclein that turns out to be not only is the test important, but our data has now shown that alpha-synuclein plays a much larger role in neurodegenerative diseases in general than we believed before. For example, we started off, it was something that was the major cause of Parkinson's and some and Lewy body dementia. What we've learned is that patients diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and this is the largest group overall of patients with neurodegenerative disease, up to somewhere between 35 and 40% of them also have misfolded synuclein proliferating in their brains. If they have both the misfolded proteins in Alzheimer's, which are beta amyloid and tau, and alpha synuclein, they tend to progress much faster, up to 3 times faster. It's a much worse disease. And ultimately, they end up with the deficits of Alzheimer's, which are largely memory, and the deficits of Lewy body dementia, which are hallucinations, inability to do executive function, and they also end up with movement disorders over time that look like Parkinson's. So we were among the first to do the studies that showed that synuclein is very important in Alzheimer's. It changes the course of the disease. It may give higher rates of side effects from the drugs that are out there. So it's very important for every Alzheimer's patient to know whether they also have synuclein, since predicting their future is important to them, and understanding the potential benefits of each new class of drug as it is introduced. It is likely to be different if it's Alzheimer's with synuclein or Alzheimer's without synuclein.
Wow. So further development, um, still
And then
driven.
there are new proteins. So there are probably, let's say, 8 to 10 misfolded proteins that cause almost all of the neurodegenerative diseases. And so being able to track those, since one of the things we've learned, and I referred to a minute ago, is that these diseases are no longer what we thought pure caused by one misfolded protein, but that most of them have what we'll call mixed pathology, that for a variety of reasons, once you have one misfolded protein, it interferes with the ability to degrade other proteins, and it may raise the concentration and cause other proteins capable of misfolding to do the same thing. So these mixed pathologies are probably the rule rather than the exception. And Amprion's goal is that our expertise is misfolded proteins. We'd like to make sure that there is an accurate and early assay for all 10 of these. And so our work is cut out for us. They all behave differently. The same things, the same rules that work for synuclein don't work
Mm.
necessarily for different forms of tau, or for a protein called TDP43 or SOD1. These are all proteins that can misfold. So we've got to develop conditions for all of these and be able to offer a panel. I'd say that's very important. Also, in the cards is right now we operate mainly in the United States. The demand in the rest of the world is equal. So we're just starting now to take our technology and move it to Europe. We have interests from South America. We have interests from Asia. So all of that requires time, money, and concerted effort to do that as well.
Russ, thank you for that. It's super exciting to hear about your science and what you guys have done, but also what you're trying to achieve. And there's so much more to do, and the impact that can have on, such a big patient population, and the lives that they're going to live is profound. But also the business side and the success you've had, and it is success, and the ability to replicate that as you add new um, product lines and modalities to what you're doing is really exciting as well. I think it's a great story, and I love this about the diagnostic space is when people in the industry hear these stories, they genuinely root for each other and they want to see those companies succeed. And this is one of those. Amprion, I by learning all this, I just get off, these sessions, and I just think I'd love to see you guys continue to do what you're doing, and continue to thrive, because it's so profound, the impact you guys are having. It's amazing.
Well, thank you for that. And, I will not hesitate to say that in order to fulfill this mission, Amprion is always raising capital. It is for all of these purposes. We know how to do it, but, that's become my full-time job and a half. Have to keep the gears of the machine well oiled. And so we're always looking for partners, particularly strategic partners who can, help us penetrate markets, understand what we need to do in different parts of the world to achieve broad success. And yeah, it's when I say it's always uphill, that's not a lament. That's just the challenge.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the status quo. It's normal to be going uphill. Yeah. Russ, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for coming on and sharing the story. Absolutely amazing. I'm really excited to get this out.
Well, thank you, David. One, for asking great questions, and two, for doing what you do, because is we I've learned, the commercial side is really about people understanding what is available to them. And what you do is critically important. You're a trusted voice, and I really appreciate the chance to tell our part of the story to you and to your trusted listeners. So thank you.
Thank you, Russ. I appreciate it.